Good morning. My name is Rabbi Chaim Belyak, and I'm pleased to welcome you to a very special program this morning in our webinar series entitled Freighted Legacies. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and we'll have an opportunity to spend an hour learning about their adventures, their philosophies, and some of the most interesting aspects of their lives currently. I'm sure you'll find this a very significant part of our webinar series. One of the things I took as our uh, sort of slogan was a quote from Leszek Kołakowski, who was a legendary professor who lived both in Poland and during its most difficult times, and then was a person who lived in exile. And it is the theme of our Freighted Legacy programs. It's titled, "We Learn from History, not in order to know how to behave or how to succeed, but to know who we are." And indeed, that seems to be a significant way of introducing our panelists in our Freighted Legacy programs. We've been offering these programs dealing with history, culture, music, and the connection of Jewish communities to this day through our Polish background and our Polish present. And today we're pleased to welcome Robert and Patricia Bernheim, who live in Maine and have an illustrious role as cultural leaders, as educators, and have a profound story to tell us about a recent visit to Poland. Formerly, both of them as undergraduates went to and graduated from Bowdoin College, but they've been a part of the Maine state community, and they have created for themselves a very interesting life, both in the formal academic world and in the informal world of the community that they live in. And they're going to be telling us about that. Robert has a PhD from McGill University in modern German history, and Patricia has gone on to develop a number of profound insights into the world of how we live, how we recycle, and the human environment that we are part of. I want to introduce them by first telling you that if you have not done so, please find the indicator at the bottom that will let you choose either English or Polish so that you can follow the talk. And at the end, we'll introduce, of course, our future programs. Robert and Patricia, welcome. And please share with us your presentation.
There we go. So his name was Feivel, and her name was Esther. Feivel and Esther Brill. And they were Jewish bakers in this small town in Galicia called Kanczuga. And Kanczuga was a small shtetl that's situated between Rzeszów and Przemyśl in the southeast part of what is today Poland and the Subcarpathian region. It had been at the time of their lives part of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and it was a very rural and yet beautiful part of the world. And you get a chance to see the contemporary, which hasn't changed much in the last 100 plus years. Now, Feivel and Esther had 7 children initially, 4 of whom lived past their second birthday. 3 of them were boys. 1 was a girl, and here is focused on 2 of the brothers and the daughter and her husband and 1 of their grandchildren. And among these 4 children was my great-grandfather, a guy by the name of Abraham Arden Brill. And Brill grew up amidst 3 cultures: the cultures of Catholic Poles, the cultures of the Jews, and the culture of the Orthodox Christians. And they had coexisted together for some 300 years in this little community of Kanczuga. Brill spoke multiple languages fluently, and he loved fresh bread and bagels from his father's bakery. He studied the Torah, he studied the Talmud, and he had memorized tremendous swaths of these religious texts by heart. Now, for some reason or reasons that we are still trying to figure out, he left the shtetl and traveled alone to New York City as a teenager. And we wonder, in family lore, was, well, his fiancee was from a prominent Jewish family. She passed away very suddenly, mysteriously. Was that the reason that he left? Or was it that he had heard all these stories from his father, who had served in the emperor's army in Mexico and talked about travel, that he wanted to travel? Or he wanted to go start the American dream? Who the heck knows? Whatever reason, he left. Or some combination. And he came to the United States with an apple in his pocket, some change, and a mandolin. And in less than 2 decades, he put himself through night school, university, and medical school. And while on a medical internship in Europe, he had the chutzpah to ask Sigmund Freud if he could take on the rights to translate Freud's works into English. And surprisingly, Freud said yes. So Brill became the first American psychoanalytic leader, and he introduced the English-speaking world to words like id and ego and superego and transference and repression, displacement, unconscious, et cetera, that have come to be associated with the field of psychoanalysis. Now, in the time allotted to us today, Patricia and I would like to unpack some of this, what we call inherited silence, that my great-grandfather brought from his hometown and his family history, and the trauma that came with the Holocaust that destroyed whatever family members he had left in Poland. And in doing so, we are hoping to navigate what we call the topography of memory and counter the malignancy of forgetfulness and forgetting through active remembrance and memorialization of the world my family once inhabited. And you might say, well, how are you going to do this? Well, we're going to do this through the joys of what we call bagel diplomacy, what Rabbi Heim calls citizen diplomacy, both now and in the future. And I'd like to echo Rabbi Beliak's welcoming of all of you. And I want to thank him and his outstanding team who work tirelessly behind the scenes to make these kind of webinars possible. So we're very grateful. So a little bit, a word or two about inherited silence. My great-grandfather wrote a 63-page introduction to the basic writings of Sigmund Freud in March of 1938. And at the end of that, as these pages were going to the printer, he wrote a footnote, and I'll give you the quote as best I can remember it. He said, and I quote, "Alas, as these pages are going to the printer, we are startled by the terrible news that the Nazi Holocaust has encircled Vienna, and that Professor Freud and his family are captives of civilization's greatest scourge," end of quote. Now, not only did the Nazi Holocaust, German Holocaust, and we learned in Poland prefer to call it, encircle Vienna, but it engulfed Kanczuga by 1942. And most of the family members who were left among our ranks were murdered, including my great-grandfather's sister, Amalia Brill Reitzfeld, her husband, Mendel, all of their children and all of their grandchildren. They were either killed at a mass execution site at the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in the neighboring hamlet of Shedlechka, or they were sent to Pelkini and then on to Belzhitz, where they were murdered at the extermination camp there. And so when that news reached my great-grandfather, it transformed him. He stopped talking. He really didn't talk much, according to the family, about the old country, but he certainly didn't talk much more after that. And he died 3 years after the war ended. And this element of inherited silence was tremendous. And it extended to one of his brothers who was in Lezhetsk, had been deported by the Germans to Siberia before June of 1941. And so he survived with his family in Siberia. My great-grandfather brought him and his family to the United States. And another brother had arrived just before the war. But nobody really talked about this. It was one of these kind of quiet topics. My uncle Edmund and my grandmother, whose name was Gioia, and her brother Edmund were both named in honor of Freud. Gioia is the Italian version of joy, and Edmund is the anglicized version of Sigmund. Sigmund Freud was my grandmother's godfather and kind of loomed large, literally and figuratively in our family lives. But what also loomed large again was this silence. Nobody talked about this. And so when I was growing up, I looked at my father's family and said, how come there's so few members of my dad's family, but so many more of my mom's family? And the answer was always the Holocaust or the war. And we don't talk about that. And that was the message I got. So this element of trauma, inherited silence, whatever, to press my great uncle, my grandmother, and they just didn't talk about it. In fact, my great uncle would say things like, oh yeah, my father never went back to the shtetl, never went back at all. That's just not true. And so he said, oh yeah, my aunt probably died of cholera at Mauthausen. That too is not true. And so he curated my great-grandfather's legacy by taking all of his papers and correspondence and moving them to the Library of Congress, the ones that he wanted to. And he left out a lot of the correspondence with his sister, with his parents, and other things that would have shed light on this. And so I personally was compelled, if you will, to learn German, to find out for myself what happened and to travel to these places. Fast forward to 2023, and I'm applying for a sabbatical. My proposal was Patricia and I would go to Poland, to Kanczuga, take up residence there. I had a historian whom I deeply respect, Ed Westerman, said, look, Robert, if you're going to go do this, don't just parachute in as a typical Jewish memory tourist does. Stay a while, learn about the community, the culture, talk to people. And so I thought, great idea, Dr. Westerman, I'll do that. But I'm also, I want to do something with food because my great-grandfather was a baker. So I was thinking, okay, well, Jewish baked goods. Well, then I got the news that I had prostate cancer. I had prostate cancer surgery and I had a catheter that was incredibly uncomfortable. And so as part of my recovery process, I started making just bagels and then more bagels. And we just give these bagels away. And they looked awful. My aunt would say to me, you know, these bagels taste great, but they really look awful. Can you do something about it? So we took a seminar with another Bowdoin graduate, a guy by the name of Jeff Mao, has an organization called Nita Nosh, and he taught us how to roll these bagels in a more aesthetically pleasing way. They look better. And so we also started to scale up during my sabbatical preparations, started to scale up. We have another Bowdoin connection. A couple of friends of ours, Chris and Kate, own a ranch, the Double Z Ranch, livestock out in Turner, Maine, and they have a commercial kitchen and a store. And so we would start making hundreds of bagels. I'm reminded of the martial arts star Bruce Lee, who said to the effect, I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but rather I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. And Chris and Kate encourage us, get really good at making these bagels and get used to making them on a large scale and get used to failing and kind of doing what the children's cartoon, The Magic School Bus, the Miss Frizzle, she'll say, you know, get messy, make mistakes. And that's what we did. For the months leading up to this time, we ramped up that production. And in May of 2024, we embarked for Poland as memory tourists before us. Alfred Dublin, Theo Richmond, Arnold Zabel, Daniel Mendelsohn, and more recently Menachem Kaiser and Ruth Moden are some of those who have gone as memory tourists into Poland. And I had some interesting experiences, which we may be able to talk about later, about memory tourism and kind of what the unwritten rules of memory tourism was. But in the past, I'd followed the pattern of, you know, parachute into the community, look around, find the synagogue, the cemetery, the former homes and businesses, maybe meet a Pole who's nice and talks to you, and then have a general feeling of suspicion about everybody else, get back to the United States and write about it online, which is what I had done. And so, thank you. there, I meant to hit this. This was kind of the three cultures view. We see these scenes out of. Okay, so we'll continue. Here's just a picture of what had been the new synagogue in 1939 when the Germans invaded and became the place from which the Jews were marched in August of 1942 to their deaths at the cemetery in Shedlechka. And here you can see on the left-hand side here, you see the town seal, which to an outsider screams Star of David. There's a Jewish community element to that. To others within Kanczuga, there was some question about whether that's true. And down here, you can see that there's some graffiti with the Star of David with the term Jidi that has been spray painted on. And again, this is 1996. So this is part of our kind of memory tourism that we had done, and we came back in 2019, and there was what we might call selective memorialization through the Jewish Historical Institute and other places up in Warsaw. They have put the Jewish cemetery sign on the main road in Shedlechka that points the way, and on that synagogue that we just saw the picture of, or the former synagogue, which is now an apartment building, there is now a plaque which was placed there in 2008 when Howard Nightingale and others helped organize a kind of a cleanup of the cemetery for the first time since the war ended. And then again, so we got a chance to see these in 2019. And while we were there, we again in 2019 got to see the Reitzfeld household, which is where the inn was, which is where my great-grandfather's sister and her family lived and played klezmer music. And here's how the cemetery at Shedlechka looked in 2019. So there was still some overgrowth, but there had been some cleanup. And again, we have these pictures that show us the cemetery in 96, where you can't tell really where the farmer's field begins and ends, or the cemetery begins and ends, and also just kind of how overgrown it was. And then in 2024, it's been 5 years since it was cleaned up, and so things have begun to grow back in this particular cemetery. Here, the road leading up to it, and then now again from 2008, on the right here, you get to see that the cemetery has been marked off as a sacred space. And the memorial to the mass graves that were there, at August morning, the men and boys dug a pit on this side, the far side of the cemetery at the base of the hill. And then they dug a second pit. The men and boys were shot and buried in this pit. And then the women and children and 2 gypsies from the community were shot the next morning. And the difficult element to this is not just that they were murdered, but also that the entire town was invited to watch the executions and picnic. And so the ritual of picnicking that we often all think about positive sense became a place where people were executed, and that gets ingrained into that trauma. So we had our first experience there. One of the first mornings we went up to the cemetery and walked around. Patricia said, well, let's take a walk around the perimeter. And as we did, she said, there's a car. And out of the car comes a man with his arms folded, and turns out he's the farmer. And we're trying to ask him if he speaks English or German or Russian. And we finally get to use Google Translate and learn that, yes, indeed, he's the farmer. These are his fields, and he doesn't care to have us walking through them. But I said, well, we're going to be in the cemetery. We're going to be here for a while. We're here to make bagels. And he looked at us quizzically like, what are you talking about? And so we said, well, can we bring some bagels to you when we get them done? And he agreed. And I said, could you write your name down and in my, handy dandy notebook? And he gave me his name and his postal code. That's it. And we continued on our way, and we made bagels. And we made a lot of bagels. So that says speaking at school, but I'll go back to this. And so we continued to kind of get ourselves acclimated. I get up every morning at 4:30. I make a bunch of bagels in the small kitchen where we were staying. And by the way, we were staying in the kitchen of a family of a young man who had found my Jewish memory tourism story from 1997 online. He was an American university student from Kanczuga, whose family had moved to Brooklyn when he was young. And he went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington as a senior in college and learned that there were Jews in his home community. He'd never known that. And so he called and we set up time and we communicated, and it was his invitation that brought me and my family back to Poland in 2019 to Kanczuga. And we spoke at the library on the life and times of my great-grandfather. And then this young man continued his own research in this field and got a master's degree from one of the local universities and wrote a book that deals with the three cultures, the Catholic, the Jews, and the Orthodox communities. And he and his family graciously opened their doors for us, and we made bagels there. And there was a great joy in this. So we finally get a chance to make some bagels. We want to bring them to the farmer. Well, we don't know where the farmer lives. So we think, okay, he must live next door to the cemetery or close by. So in this part of Poland, people have gates on their properties. And we went to the first home that the gate was open. We knocked on the door, and answering the door is a middle-aged man, and he's got a t-shirt, he's got underwear, boxer shorts, and some slides, and he has a little dog, the little yip yip dog. And we ask him, Shemovi po angielsku, and he says, no. And we show him the name, and he goes like this and tells us to come with him. And he counts 3, and I interpret that as 3 houses to the left. But he made this little squiggly move with his hand. And Patricia said, it must be a road behind there. I said, oh, no. It's just 3 houses on the left. Go to the third house on the left, knock on the door. A woman answers. She only has a bathrobe on. And we ask her if this person, the farmer, is here. And she says, Momente clothed. She comes out dressed and takes us into her backyard, opens this gate from a hedge. And it was like walking into the world of Narnia. Behind is the farmer's house. There was a road. Patricia was absolutely right. I was wrong. And there's the farmer's wife, his grandkids, one of his daughters. And there's a huge stack of pancakes and a picnic table. And we bring the bagels, and the bagels opened up an incredible conversation. So through Google Translate, we spent several hours. His wife brought out the most incredible farmer's soup with fresh bread. And then they invited us in to have tea and cakes and cookies that they had got from the Catholic service, the Catholic reception, when their granddaughter had her first communion that Sunday before. And we talked for hours about legacy, about memory. And then the farmer's wife picks up the phone and she calls a relative. And this woman says, I'll meet you at the Jewish cemetery tomorrow. And so, okay, we do. But she brings along a 95-year-old eyewitness to this picnic massacre. And he tells us horrific stories. And he shows us things. And we have, again, a conversation. We bring the bagels. He tells the story. And so through this woman who met us at the cemetery, she says, I want you to see if you can speak to a student group, because she'd been a former teacher. So she said, I'll help you arrange a visit with students. And so that's where we bring bagels. But we didn't speak in the school. We spoke at the local library, which had moved from where it was when I was there in 96 and 2019 to a new location in the town of Kanczuga. And we spoke to freshmen in high school who had never heard the story of the Jews in their community. They'd also never had bagels before. They didn't know what bagels were. They didn't know how to cut a bagel. And so it led to, again, conversations from this. We tried to go to the mayor's office and ask the mayor if he could meet with us. And an assistant from the mayor came out and said, the mayor has no time for you now. The mayor has no time for you next week. The mayor has no time for you at all. And we went to the bank. And one of the things we learned from trying to find where my family's bakery was was looking at this cadastral map from 1849. And you have a picture of the Rinnick, which is this white space in the middle. St. Maria's Orthodox Church is off to the side, and the big Catholic Church, St. Michael's Church, is over here. And at House 195 was the Brill House. And there was some discussion if the bakery sat on this side of the Rinnick, it was part of the house, but it was the house is no longer there, but there is a bank there today. And so we went into the bank and asked about speaking to the, to give some bagels. And one of the bank tellers said, "No, thank you. We don't want your bagels." And so I went outside and I was like, who doesn't want a good bagel? I just couldn't understand it. And Patricia, who also has a Mary Kay business, was like, that woman's a gatekeeper, asked to see the manager. And I needed a kick in the butt. So we went back in and I asked her to speak to the manager. And she said, "We don't have managers here in Poland. We have directors." And then I said, "Well, may we speak to the director, please?" And she said yes. And then the director came down and he gladly took our bagels. And so what is typical is that there are obviously no Jews left in this community anymore, but where the Brill House was, or a shoe store, which was a former Jewish home along the Rinnick, we see this frequently. When we were getting ready to go, Patricia had talked about doing some textile diplomacy, using sewing and the making of quilts to kind of help us begin a conversation. So I'll let her talk a little bit about this element.
Yes, and so my original idea was to create a memory quilt. Wouldn't that be something that they could relate to? It's a textile, and maybe people are ready to share their stories of war or lack thereof. And but before we left, I had not very much luck in getting people to getting some feedback on that and to commit. So I said, well, that's fine. And my neighbor is very helpful. She said, "Why don't you bring this?" And so I brought a sewing project that I could share with the community to try to build that bridge of diplomacy and textiles. As we began to meet these people, these Polish people, one was the curator of a museum, and she was doing an exhibit on embroidery. So she invited us to the exhibit, and we attended. And then she said, "Well, I'm having a workshop. Would you be willing to participate?" And I said, "Sure." Not knowing very much Polish, that was a stretch, but I willingly went to try to see what I could do in terms of building the bridges and creating that textile diplomacy. So there I am on the left, working very much alone, because the group on my right was very Polish, and they did they kind of spoke to themselves, as we might do in the US when we're speaking English and there's one foreign speaker in a class, and same with the other side. But during lunch, I met this lovely woman who spoke English and made us feel a little bit more comfortable. The instructor did speak English and took it upon himself to practice his English while teaching the class in Polish. Incredible young man who knew 700 stitches in embroidery. So I was totally blown away. And I was thinking these women were all beginners. Well, at the end of the workshop, they held up their pieces, and it was obvious they had not been beginners. Some were very well into their regional embroidery, and I was just very, I sensed a real openness from many of them, and from there, we had an invitation to go to um, this young woman's house who did speak English. She says, well, my mother makes the best projecki, and would you come? And so we did. One thing led to another, and we went
We brought the
and
bagels.
we brought bagels and met her parents, and they served an awesome table of homemade cheese from their neighbors, homemade jams,
Homemade
and
lemonade.
projecki and homemade lemonade. And they were just wonderful people, not knowing any English, but we were able to
With her
translate with the daughter, and get to know these people. They didn't want it to end. We didn't want it to end. And the woman said, well, I'm doing directing at my church, so would you like to come? And we thought, hey, great, we'll go to her church. Well, it's the biggest church in Chevorsk, and has a 400-year-old baptismal, which just totally blows us away as Americans, because we think our country is old, but the old over in the old land is very old. And we had an interesting
So yeah, she was a choir director and
experience. Yeah.
But again, here's a couple of people of Jewish heritage who are going into a Catholic church, going to choir practice and getting to know people and having an experience. And again, it's bagels, and in this case, embroidery, that opened the door for us with these kind of diplomatic elements. Through this too, we also were invited to participate in some professional bakeries. Now, the young man whose house we stayed in, he introduced us to the woman who is the curator of the museum. And then she introduced us to a food historian from Rzeszów, and also a baker from one of the neighboring hamlets. And this baker from the neighboring hamlet invited us over to make bagels in a bakery. And then we were invited through the food historian to make bagels at a commercial bakery in Rzeszów. And so we did these things, and our daughter, our youngest daughter, and her fiance joined us for the last part of our sabbatical time there. And we went to these places, first Patricia and I, locally to the professional bakery, and then the four of us to this one in the city, and had an incredible experience teaching the making of bagels. And again, the historical significance of bagels being reintroduced to a bagel desert 80 years after they've been there. And people had a hunger to know, physical hunger. Yeah, we want to eat these bagels, but also a hunger of knowledge. What is this? What does this stand for? And for us, that was very significant as an element and part of our kind of awareness and kind of bringing this full circle, because there's a lot of silence and absence of Jewish life in these communities. The picture on the left here, you can see, is from a door frame where a mezuzah had been in Lezhensk, and here is a part of a headstone that has been returned to the Jewish cemetery in Shedlechka that's been cleaned up, but somebody had it in their own home or was in their garden, and they decided to bring it back. So this element, kind of the unspoken things, the absence of Jewish life, absence of Yiddishkeit, the absence of music, the soundscape, these were things that obviously are different, and we were very acutely aware of as we went about. And there are some challenges. You can see here some graffiti with the Star of David. Again, the term Jidi being used oftentimes. We saw Juda or Juden being used, the German term for Jew or Jews. And some of the locals explained to us, well, that's kind of like a put down in the European football world if you call someone a Jew. But even that use, the pejorative use of the word Jew, was very interesting to us and somewhat shocking. And then here, this comes from a memorial marker in, and I'm going to mess this up if I'm not careful, Yagawa Nishchauka, which is where the 7 to 10 Jews were taken from Kanczuga in March. Well, they were buried there after being killed almost a year after the war ended by local Poles in Kanczuga. They were murdered with grenades and bullets, including my grandmother's first cousin, Izzy Reitzfeld, and his wife, who was pregnant at the time, Hannah Krieger, and another half dozen or so other Jews who had survived the war. And then the Jews from Markova who were killed after the Ulma family and all the folks that were hiding, the Goldmans, the Diedners, and the Grunfelds, all the other Jews who were murdered in Markova and around Markova were taken to the cemetery of the unwanted and buried in these mass graves. And so there's some tough topics that we also had some incredible conversations with the locals about. And one of the things our youngest daughter found was that there's a tagline for the library in Kanczuga, and it translates to "Secrets live here." And we thought my daughter, is also an academic. She's working on her PhD in heritage studies from the University of Stirling in Scotland and focused on this area too. And so this for her and for us is very appropriate, that there are secrets that live in Kanczuga and around Kanczuga. They're in the ground, they're in the architecture, they're in the stories and the memories and the landscape. And so these are things that we think about. And as we draw this to a conclusion before we get to the Q&A session, I do want to say that, it was bagels and textile embroidery that allowed us to have conversations, but we met some incredible people whom we admired deeply. We can think about, well, what remnants of material culture are left? We've seen some small dreidels that were found. We've seen candlesticks. We've seen glass plate negatives that were recovered in and around the area. I'm always looking for, the bread or the bread trough or the dough trough that my great-grandparents used, or great-great-grandparents used, and what happened to the recipes, all these things. And yet we were warmly welcomed by people who were absolute strangers, who were fearless in facing challenging topics about the legacy of absence, the absence of the Yiddishkeit in this region of Poland. But they demonstrated incredible courage, incredible compassion, and a willingness to assist, to translate. We had the food historian's daughter was a translator, and she came with us and spent hours translating things for us. Amazing, the curator of the museum, lots of different times, and to talk about great and small topics. And we got a chance to break bread with the locals, literally the bread of a bagel, and then other Polish kind of regional things. And this was beyond our expectations. And we learned that, we are not, as when the Kinsler calls us, the gatekeepers of memory. We're not the only gatekeepers of memory. And so this is an unfolding element. And we are so honored that bagel diplomacy and textile diplomacy could give us kind of that aspect of an entrance into that world. And, I think about just kind of what all of this entails, and it's just it's overwhelming, and yet at the same time we are really, really honored. And so I want to thank you for that time. I'm going to end this share. I can find out how to do this and open this up to questions.
First of all, Patricia and Robert, thank you. This has brought us very personally and very directly into what I think is a very different way of visiting Poland than most people have experienced. I can tell you that not a week goes by when I'm asked, what do you recommend? I want to go to Poland. I think I would like to go to the city that my ancestors are from. And you have chosen a path that is quite unusual. And already we have a number of questions that have come to the fore. And I know that people are anxious to ask them. They can be asked in chat, or they can be asked in the Q&A. I'm going to start with the ones that appear in the Q&A, and one is an anonymous question. Do you sell bagels in Maine?
So thank you for the question. We have started a LLC called Feivel's Old World Bagels and Bakery, but I'm a full-time professor, so this is a bit of a side hustle. And I don't have we don't have a commercial kitchen, but we are still working with Chris and Kate over in Turner, and we are beginning a pilot subscription program to sell our bagels, so that we're kind of bageling every other week, every 2 weeks. We're producing bagels in large quantities and then making those available for sale. So we're getting there slowly but surely. But again, there is this form of connecting with my family. It's a form of active remembrance for me to make bagels. And we do all this by hand, and it is an honor and a joy to do so. So we do have our own place, and we're starting making bagels in Maine. We've mostly just given away. I mean, in Poland, we make them in the kitchen of this young man's house, and we just give them away. We'd go and we gave them to the neighbors across the street. Would give us cherries, and so we, bring them bagels, or the, people in the Rinnick, where there's a flower shop, a photography shop, the kebab shop, and people in the farmers market in Chevors who sold us eggs. We say, hey, would you like to try some of our bagels? And everyone was so gracious. The thing about the cream cheese was a little difficult. That's a traditional topping here in the United States, but people didn't know what it was. They knew what Philadelphia was by its brand name, but there wasn't a lot of it always available in stores.
Interesting response. A little more serious question by a fellow historian for you. Public historians often speak of the importance of triangulation of narratives, so that there is always some corroboration of the histories collected. Your bagel work seems to allow stories to stand without triangulation, more in line with Claude Lanzmann's Shoah. So now a comment.
So wonderful. First of all, Claude Lanzmann's Shoah is remarkable, and I'm not saying our work is anywhere like that kind of work, but I appreciate the triangulation. But again, in the sake of time, we can't really do this. So one of the things we did was we said it's really important that we have documentation, that we have triangulation. I look at it like a mosaic, for instance. Have this big picture that's made up of stones, and if you don't have all the stones to fill out the mosaic, you have missing pieces. And so we wanted to make sure, so there are archives in Przemyśl that deal with the Jewish historical record. The archives in Warsaw. We have archives from the German occupation. The Reichsarbeitsdienst, the German Reich work service, was stationed in and around Kanczuga. My work in the invasion of the Soviet Union, several of the German divisions, the 257th Infantry Division, for instance, and some of the other, I think the 295th German Infantry Division, were all bivouacked and stationed around Kanczuga before the invasion. So we're trying to find German documentation, archival documentation, and then stories. I mean, we heard incredible stories from folks, from Poles who would share their stories with us. So there are gaps, admittedly so, and I really appreciate the question. And then we're still trying to fill these gaps in. Photographic records, again, diaries, nonfiction narratives, stories that we get from oral testimonies that were given at the Shoah Foundation, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Fortnoff Archive at Yale University, trying to get some of these again to fill in the gaps from that, so that we use that great phrase, the triangulation with the narratives and corroboration, so we can fill that up. But the sake of time, we didn't really get a chance to talk more about that, and I'm still exploring those. It's a great question, and I welcome the opportunity. If anyone has information on Kanczuga or the surrounding areas that fills in some of those gaps, please, by all means, send that to us.
Robert, I'm going to ask as kind of a follow-up question, even though that was Richard Hecht who asked that question. Now comes a question from an attorney that is in the same vein, but I think with a different slant. Is there anywhere we can read about what people told you in the interviews? Um, and a second part of that is, this may be a very naive question, but why did it take courage for people to help you?
Great questions. Thank you for these. So the first part, anywhere to read this. So I'm working on a piece for a peer-reviewed journal that will appear probably in 2026. I would love to put this in a book someday. Again, time. And so my wife chuckles. When you have cancer surgery, things change, right? Or maybe you shouldn't take cancer surgery to change your perspective on life, and the beauties and the joys and the transparency and the real short elements of life. But I'm very grateful for that life. And so, yes, I'm trying to write this down to talk about this. And these are, a myriad of stuff. Everybody, almost every family said, our family helped a Jew. And at first, I kind of had this is my posture, like, really? Come on, are you serious? And then as the conversations moved on, we talked about, it may have been a meal. It may have been an opportunity, a place to hide, someone who might open a door, a ride to some other place to escape somewhere, may have been, a tip. There are lots of things that we learned about that I was just really shocked by. And I'm trying to, again, a lot of anecdotal things that we're trying to put together. So I want to frame those within their anecdotal context without really, there's no really way that, we can corroborate some of these stories. So I'll just report them as these are the stories that are told. So we're in the process of writing that down. It doesn't discount that what they said happened or not happened, but it's really important that those stories are there. And for me, they fill that out. Why did it take courage? It took courage because what we've learned, and again, this is a challenging topic based on last month's focus on freighted legacies, is that there have been kind of the unpacking the freezer, if you will, that oftentimes it's used, the communist era version of what happened during the Second World War and the Holocaust, the suffering of the Poles, and this element of, I'll give you a quick answer. When I spoke in a German classroom one time with a dear friend who's a teacher and a university professor who helps teachers in training, I said, when I'm in Germany, I think about the Holocaust every day. And one courageous young man raised his hand, and I say courageous again. And he said, Professor Bernheim, when you step out your door in Maine every day, do you think about Native American Indians? Do you think about African Americans and what your country did to these minorities? You think about what happened to Japanese and internment camps in World War II in the United States. And I was floored. I didn't know what to say. And I finally said, no, I do not, but now I will. And so I got to thinking about that. How do we, kind of former West German President Richard von Weizsäcker gave a speech in May of 1985 on the 40th anniversary of the end of the war. And he kind of challenged Germans to look the truth straight in the eye and look at what happened in their country in the name of their nation, what Hitler did and how they all behaved. And I think for some of the courage comes from a conversation and not a conflict that starts with a bagel or some textiles that says, what happened in this nation? What did my family do? What did my neighbors do? And the demographics are interesting. In Kanczuga, many of the families are still there that were there in World War II. I've been there for centuries. There's not been a lot of it's not a land frozen in time, but there's a lot, the demographics are only beginning to shift now, becoming more of a bedroom community for Rzeszów and other places, a bigger city. But it's so a long answer to that is that there is a bit of courage to face, well, what did my family do or not do? Did we collaborate with the Germans? Did we resist? And is that like an either or was it, there's lots of shades of gray? And so that's why that would be my response.
Patricia, it looks like you have another thought on that, or am I just
Oh, no,
reading wrong?
I've been taking notes.
He
Okay.
always has thoughts on things. They're very good. So,
This is very, this is a very interesting response. I have another question here, sort of a basic question from a neighbor, Laura Bernal. Were bagels strictly a Jewish food before the war, and or did Poles in general have bagels in daily life? Sort of a
so
yes.
again, these are wonderful questions. One, Maria Belinska wrote a book back in, I think it was 2009, 2010, called The Bagel, The Surprising History of a Modest Bread. And she really outlines kind of the history of the bagel. Its origins go back to the 1200s, where German Jewish travelers are moving from, or German-speaking Jewish travelers are moving from the West to the Eastern Europe, and they're coming into the lands of what is traditionally Poland. And in the 1300s, they're making bagels, and there's lots of misconceptions. There was this idea that in 1683, in honor of King Jan Sobieski III defeating the Ottomans in Vienna, that the bakers there made, a round piece of bread in the shape of a stirrup and called it a bagel. But the bagels were in action hundreds of years before that. And I think it's in 1610 that the bagels first mentioned in a Yiddish document that talks about kind of sumptuary laws and other things, and notes that bagels were given to women who had just given birth because they're round, right? The circle of life, and they're also seen as a kind of a symbol against, kind of a talisman against evil. They were given at the circumcision at the bris for boys, and they became a huge part of Jewish mourning rituals as well. And then, so there's also the abarzanek, which is a kind of a cousin to the bagel, which is a Polish bread that's also round, but it's twisted. Oftentimes it's made with the dairy product with milk, and it's not served, of course, during Lent. And so there's a lot of times where bagels and other, not just for Jews, but for ethnic Poles and Orthodox Christians are having, these breads as well. And what's interesting, side note here, one of the documents, sorry about archival evidence, there was a Catholic priest in Kanczuga at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, who made a note in his private diary that is now obviously public, that he complains that my great-great-grandfather's breads and bagels were much better than the Catholic offerings, and kind of implied that shouldn't be so. Or, how is it that these Jews are making better breads and rolls and bagels and so forth than our version of things? So the bagel and Poland go hand in hand. And then the disappearance of the bagel, you see it in big cities today, but we found, a fellow traveler found some at Lidl, at this kind of grocery store in Rzeszów. And some of these restaurants were making them, but people complained they just taste like round bread. What's missing here? So they go back a long, long time. And of course, they're brought to America by Jewish immigrants from Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe. And they used to be sold oftentimes around the necks of these peddlers who would peddle them with a ring of bagels literally around their necks and in baskets all over Poland.
Precursor to the plastic and paper bags that we used.
That's correct.
For transport. These questions are, in some sense, going a little deeper into areas you've covered. Again, from Laura, would you mind talking about the legacy of distrust and animosity on the part of Jewish people towards Poles? How have you overcome that? And so that's your next seminar that will invite you back.
Yeah.
But if you just maybe give us some thoughts about that.
Sure. Welcome to the question. So the stereotype is that, you've had Yitzhak Shamir and others, former prime minister of Israel, say that Poles drink anti-Semitism in the milk of their mothers, right? So it's a long-standing thing. And many groups would say this. When we first started going back, when I went back in 96, some of the survivors from Kanczuga whom I met had said, don't go back because the Poles there are mean-spirited and they, took our homes, our businesses. And my first encounter in Kanczuga in 96, after we had this give you a quick distillation. We drove in, my friend, his brother, and myself, and the three of us went to the library and I asked where the Jewish cemetery was. And the person on duty at the library said, there's no Jewish cemetery in and around here. And I produced a document from the Jewish Historical Institute that showed the map and showed there was one nearby. How do I get to Shedlechka? And she then calls up somebody, and within 15 minutes or so, an elderly gentleman appears with a teenage girl by his side. I thought it was his granddaughter. It turns out it was his neighbor's granddaughter. She had taught herself English by watching American movies on television that in the post-communist, the first 6 years or so after post-communism. And so they took us, she translated, and they took us to this Jewish cemetery. And he told us exactly what I've heard others tell since about the picnic, about the executions, and he knew my family. So that came to the forefront. And when we were coming back to our car, there were several men who had gathered around in the Rinnick area where there's a series of parking lots who had tire irons. And they were going like this with the tire irons, like they're communicating to us it's time to leave. So that just reinforced to me this element. And then in 2019, after I got done speaking in the library, a young woman raised her hand and asked the question, why do you hate us? I'm not an observant Jew. And I was like a stand-in for Robert the Jew, Robert Bernheim the Jew with a Jewish last name. Why do you people, you Jews, hate us? Because we are not you shouldn't be hating on us. And I said, I don't. But again, that didn't translate. Well, not translate's not right. It didn't land the same. And so one of the things that in planning this trip and keeping the words of Dr. Ed Westerman in mind, taking up residency was going to be a way to help dispel that, because we don't know about what happened in daily life during the occupation. We didn't know, we knew some things. I could know things, book knowledge, but I don't know, because I hadn't really talked to ethnic Poles about their experiences one-on-one and had those experiences. And again, it was over food with the farmer, his wife, hours talking about the farmer's family hid 2 Jewish girls. And eventually they had to let those young girls leave. They were at risk of being exposed. They went into the woods and they were captured and murdered. And yet they've been kept in this farm for months, according to the farmer. Again, how do I know this is true? I don't, but these are stories that are really, and hurt, again, many of these things. And that helped us kind of break down some of the trust and the distrust issues that may have been kind of in the back of our minds. And yet at the same time, we're acutely aware of the political climate. And, we've been to Markova at the museum. We've had these conversations, and these are not easy topics. And so it's not like it's poof, it's gone, because we see, again, anecdotal examples of people who don't want us there and don't think we have a right to be there. And are thinking, are you here to come back and take, there's laws that are in place. You can't come and get your family property back. You can't get that bakery back again. And so there are these elements that they raise their ugly heads again, and we just keep working through them. And again, a bagel softens a lot of that hardness of conflict. It's not a panacea. And things are found in the ground. Things come up. And then you think, oh, does that belong in a museum? Or is that in someone's personal collection? So a lot of kind of head games that continue to go on.
Mhm.
I'm going to take a question as a statement. People will notice this series of Freighted Legacies is going to be coming back to these questions, both by historians, by individuals. These are live questions that we're talking about today, living questions, I should say. But this is part of a question asked by Judy Coleman on more, she asked a more frivolous question about were they poppy seed bagels or sesame seed bagels. We'll leave that aside for a moment. But she said, I was wondering whether you, as a German history scholar, have ever wondered why Poland and the Polish people's approach to the Holocaust history has been so different. And I think I would say so different than uh, what we read in the massive work of Jan Grabowski and his colleagues. And I don't think I'm going to ask you to answer that. I'm going to leave it as a question because it will endure through our conversations. Um, and I want to refer to what's coming up in Freighted Legacies, but not before I thank you both for your enthusiasm for making these living questions and for the fact that now everybody who's been listening and probably everybody who will see the video will be writing you to request bagels. I hope you have your price sheet up and a good way of getting them from, in my case, from Maine to Northern California, please. Um, uh, and we are appreciative of all that you've taught us this seminar and all that you've raised as questions. The profoundness of your questions remains with us. I want to refer now to our upcoming program, and we are going to be hearing from historian Michael Steinloff and his work, which is shortly going to be up on a slide, um, um, uh, is part of our Freighted Legacy series for February 16th at 10 a.m. Normally, we do not assign reading in these gatherings. This is an opportunity for people to hear, and we've gotten lots of people writing us back and saying, you know, I was led to read so-and-so's book. If I could, let me hazard the possibility that these two books, Bondage to the Dead, which returns us to many of the questions that we've raised today, through the work, early work in American Jewish consciousness by a historian, a person who I've had the privilege of meeting, Michael Steinloff, as is often the case when Jews of various backgrounds, classes, and attitudes get together. We decided that we didn't have only bagels, but we had some sledge, we had some herring to build our friendship, and had a wonderful opportunity to sit with Michael 3 weeks ago, and in his home, as we talked about his upcoming program that will deal with the historical book, with the book of history that he wrote early in his career. And then 2 years ago, he published a book called This Was Not America, a wrangle through Jewish, Polish, American history. It's a more personal book. It's about him and his family and what the meaning of coming from a certain class and a certain experience of Polish life meant to survivors living in America. Michael grew up speaking Polish here in America. And of course, he learned English. And his long and illustrious career will, I think, lead us to some more conversation that will be very important. That's February 16th. And we'll have publicity out, and we hope that you're available to join us. I want to call your attention to a second program of the work of Friends of Jewish Renewal in Poland. This is the inaugural lecture. We're not going to invite you to all 30 lectures, but we have translated a book on the history of Jews, which is a general textbook that's used in classes in America, which was published by the Jewish Publication Society. It's used in synagogues and in academic settings, but there was nothing quite like it in Polish. And we're now doing the final copy editing. On January 30th, three of the main teachers who are Polish, Rabbi Menachem Mirsky, who has a congregation in Long Beach, California, and who next week is getting married. I wish him a mazel tov. Rabbi Mati Kirschenbaum, who is in a neighboring community in Fullerton, California, and Rabbi Miriam Klimova, who's originally from Lviv, but did her BA and MA in Poland in Hebrew Studies and was ordained last year by Hebrew Union College as a rabbi. All three rabbis, one conservative rabbi, two reform rabbis, will join together as the teachers of this class, along with two Polish professors, and they will be sharing with us in this same format the first class of Turning Points in Jewish History. We want to thank the Jewish Publication Society for the permission to offer this, and we see this as a contribution not only to Jewish life in Poland, but to the possibility that the work that we do has an impact on what people can learn about Judaism and Jews in contemporary Poland. So these are two programs that we would love to call to your attention, one on a Thursday and one on a Sunday. Again, I want to turn to our guests and thank you both for your participation. I'm wondering if you have any final thoughts maybe that you would like to share.
Good question. I think it's just this is an unfolding time, an unfolding series of events, and I really I find it remarkable. Heinrich Heine had a quote, and I'll end with this. Es ist doch eine alte Geschichte, doch bleibt es immer neu. It's an old story that always remains new. And I think that as well as Jacob Goldberg's, there's no history of Poland without the history of the Jews, and no history of the Jews without the history of Poland. They go hand in hand. And I think that's, it's an old story, but it's always new. But it's a story that is a conjoined story, and one that's really important, and it continues to develop and unfold. So I'm excited to continue to explore this. Perhaps we're going to have a bagel fest in Rzeszów at some point, some kind of using a food festival as a way of introducing culture, but also history into a conversation.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the technical people if I can be allowed to share for 1 second. I want to share with you, I'm trying to do this, I'm the technically least capable person. This is an article that appeared in yesterday's Haaretz. Poland's star is rising. Israelis better take note. While old powers are declining, Poland is on the rise in Europe it's time for Israelis revise their view of the country. And this is by a person that is decidedly in a different place in the host of Haaretz uh, journalists. His name is Ofra Ilani, and it's an article well worth looking for. We'll post it with after we get permission on our website. But it's an interesting, um, I think, echo of some of the things that we're talking about today. Again, I want to thank our panelists. Um, I want to acknowledge the profound work of Dominika Zakaszewska, who has put the technical magic together. She actually showed me how she does it, and it's something that needs. I don't know if Dominika, we can see you for just a moment to thank you, and I also want to acknowledge the people who've been interpreting. Mark Yazovsky, if we could ask you to let us see you for a second. And Marjana, if that would be possible, we want to thank you for accompanying us. And we hope that we can continue to develop more participation from polls. At the same time that we are about to add a third channel, which is in Hebrew. And Dominica hasn't heard about this yet, so I hope I'm not upsetting her day. Thank you all. Your support for the work of Friends of Jewish Renewal in Poland is significant, especially during this time when we are restructuring the continuation of not only our Freighted Legacy programs, our translation programs, our work with synagogues and developing cultural ties is significant in making what we do possible. So I invite you to go to www.jewishrenewalinpoland.org. Many thanks again, and have a good day.